that radical inclusion is more than just an idea, and certainly one bigger here at Montgomery College. It's a movement. And Montgomery College is at the forefront of practicing radical inclusion in higher education. And we're surrounded by organizations and people whose work around radical inclusion is equally passionate. We partner with businesses in our community that believe in opportunity that skilled employment gives all of our residents. We work with the nonprofit community to help our immigrant students connect with the support that they need. We collaborate daily with networks of donors who use their time and treasure to help students access education, internships, and jobs. My own journey was one of radical inclusion on several levels, so I see some of myself in every student that we have the opportunity of serving here at Montgomery College. Yet, despite our shared idealism, our current political climate has many elements of radical exclusion for immigrants, for people of color, for working class people, and for those without access to opportunity. And this year alone, we have seen attitudes about these topics polarizing our nation at alarming rates. We've seen vitriol in Supreme Court hearings, violence against peaceful protesters at white supremacist rallies, and a wave of police shootings that have drawn indignation and protests in cities across the nation. The conversations in our country have been corroded by hostility and resentment. That's why I think that hosting events such as the one that we're here today, in which we come together physically, we create the town center, not just on our telephones and not just through social media, that we spend time grappling with those topics and issues that make us somewhat uncomfortable, but topics that benefit us all. It builds civility in our discourse, which is fundamental to our democracy, and it allows us to share strategies about radical inclusion in our areas of expertise. We may each be fighting for equality in our individual niches areas, but transformational change depends on synchronizing all of our efforts individually and collectively. That's when we make systems change. That's when our impact is measured in policy revisions and legal change. Tonight's speaker, Dave Zirin, uses his platform regularly to call out the corporatization of professional sports that leaves many of its athletes psychologically bullied and physically broken. Zirin's body of work shows more broadly how race and wealth unite to write the rules that discourage radical inclusion in professional athletes. He also shows how individual athletes have used their own success to serve as role models for others and to highlight political and social inequality. I'm going to let Julian Hayes tell you a bit more about David Zirin's accomplishments in just a moment, but I do want to share something with you about Julian, who will be introducing our speaker formally. He is the Maryland Program Director at the Meyer Foundation, and he formerly worked at Achieving the Dream, of which our college is a member. He also managed the Working Student Success Network, which is a national initiative focused on low-income community college students. So he has a great deal of expertise and passion about tackling the complex array of factors that can impede student success in our classrooms and certainly within our organizations. The Meyer Foundation has worked in the Washington, D.C. area for over 75 years. It invests in solutions that build equity in our communities so that economically disadvantaged people have access to opportunity in housing, in education, in employment, and in asset building. The Meyer Foundation generously responded to our request for sponsorship this year, for which we are deeply grateful. Students, if you have a copy of the book that we'll be talking about, This man who's coming up is the one that you thank for that. Please welcome a champion of radical inclusion, Julian Hayes.
Thank you, Dr. Pollard. It is a true honor to be here this evening to introduce tonight's guest speaker. The Meyer Foundation was drawn to Montgomery College because of the powerful work it does in the community and because we saw the provocative lineup of this series and wanted to be supportive. So just a bit more about the Meyer Foundation to add to Dr. Pollard's remarks. The Meyer Foundation pursues and invests in solutions that build an equitable Greater Washington community in which economically disadvantaged people thrive. We envision a just, connected, and inclusive Greater Washington community in which systemic racism and its consequences no longer exist. Our overarching strategy is to use all our resources, networks, and our voice to advance a vision of equity across the Greater Washington region in partnership and collaboration with community organizations, individuals, et cetera, to advance our work across the 4 goal areas that we have, as Dr. Pollard mentioned, in housing, education, employment, and asset building. Among other things, we at the Meyer Foundation believe the challenges our region faces are interconnected, and the link between poverty and racial equity is not incidental, but structural and causal. And that systemic racism is historic and persistent. It is embedded in the policies, practices, institutions, and systems found at the root of many of our regions and our nation's greatest challenges. This has been an incredible journey for the Meyer Foundation to merge our strategic plan with our more intensive focus on racial equity and systems change. And we are so pleased to be able to partner with institutions like Montgomery College, who are advancing their own racial equity and systems change work, as evidenced this evening. Personally, I'm quite fascinated with the intersection of sports, politics, and race, so this evening's event is of particular interest. When I was asked to introduce Dave Zirin, my first thought was, where should I begin? The list of professional athletes about whom Zirin has written is very impressive. Not only are these people whose athleticism inspires awe, but they are some of the best critical thinkers and the most introspective people in sports history. They are people who thought carefully about how race and class inflected their own personal journeys to stardom and what life is like for those without their natural talents. Dave Zirin has written about athletes like John Carlos, whose iconic photo was captured at the 1968 Olympics, raising his fist on the medal stand signifying Black power. He has written about Muhammad Ali's provocative Vietnam War protests and his role in the Black freedom movement when both of these movements were in their infancy. He has written about Jim Brown, an early leader in the struggle for racial equality, but one who disagrees with Colin Kaepernick's form of protest. Zirin has written about Jackie Robinson, whom many historians celebrate for breaking the color barrier by entering the major leagues in 1947, but fail to note how haunted he was by the narrative of his own exceptionalism. Beneath all of Zirin's stories are powerful currents of political and social change. He writes about real people who have remarkable athletic talent, yet still exist in gendered, racialized bodies. Their talent and fame might position them to enjoy lives of economic freedom, but few of them have stopped there. In fact, straddling 2 worlds has moved many of them to acts of profound public protest. Football player Colin Kaepernick is a more recent example, well known for his refusal to stand for the national anthem and his subsequent exclusion from professional teams. Michael Bennett, Dave Zirin's co-author of Things That Make White People Uncomfortable, has also been an outspoken critic of racism. He has brought his political opinions to the locker room and on the playing field. Zirin's insights on these compelling stories and his historical depth around social movements create rich, provocative narratives which should challenge us all in our thinking. Dave Zirin is currently the sports editor for The Nation. He is also the co-host of the radio show The Collision with Etan Thomas and hosts the Edge of Sports podcast. He has written an extraordinary 10 books on the politics of sports, and we are so pleased to have him here this evening to engage in conversation and dialogue with Dr. Pollard. Please welcome Dave Zirin.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, and thank you, Madam President.
Absolutely delighted. One of the things that I know for sure is that Montgomery College has some of the most talented faculty in the nation. And one of the things we did not say in that introduction that we should have is, thanks to some outstanding faculty members who are here, we also have you as a part-time faculty member teaching for us this semester, teaching the history of sports, which I understand is strongly enrolled in a very rigorous and vigorous conversation space as well. So we are delighted to have you here. And audience, just by way of orientation, just so you know how this will play, I have inevitably walked in with too many questions. And your job will be to ensure that I don't get to ask them all. The intent is that I'll go probably until about 8 o'clock in a dialogue format to pose some questions and responses. And we've already started. I got a whole commentary, something I'm adding that wasn't even a part of this. And then I'll open it up. There are 2 mics that are in the audience here. We'd ask you to come to the mic, pose your questions succinctly, because I don't want to interrupt you that much, but we want to make sure as many questions that can be asked can be done. And then we'll conclude at 8:30. Those of you who will be able to stay, we'll have a reception in the foyer, and of which Dave has graciously agreed to sign books here. So, but I'm going to be first. Let me get mine signed before we get done. So my questions span almost the same order of the text. Those of you, the book, if you've read it or have seen it. But I'm going to start off more broadly at first. And I find it fascinating that you have chosen to dedicate a career to writing about sports and how you see it operating in a political space. So I'd love to invite you, as a way of orienting the audience to you, but also to the work you do, to talk a little bit about how you got into this gig of writing about athletics and sports. And then, of the 10 books that you have written, do you see any parallel themes that you might want to lift up about African American athletes in any given moment that you've written about?
Okay, so we start with a small question.
I know.
Can I ask the crowd a question before I answer? Just because this will help me in terms of what I say and how I talk. Like, how many people here consider yourselves like diehard sports fans?
Not at all. Me personally.
Okay. How many consider yourselves a casual sports fan? And how many would rather shave your head with a cheese grater than hear somebody talk about sports? Is that okay? Well, Cass, what's your name?
Natalia.
Natalia. Okay. So the goal, I think, for this dialogue is to do something that speaks to the diehard sports fan, the casual sports fan, and Natalia. If we can pull that off, we'll be in great shape. Now, as for myself, you know, I grew up playing sports. That's where it started for me. I played every sport except golf, which is, of course, not a sport.
No.
That's my theory, is that anything that you can smoke cigarettes or gain weight while doing is not a sport. And that's where I draw the line. And I was the starting center for my high school basketball team. We were terrible. I'm not that tall. We were called the Fighting Quakers. So not so scary. And so played all these sports, never gave any thought to the politics of sports until 1996. I was in college at the time, and there was a basketball player by the name of Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf who made the private decision that he was not going to come out for the national anthem. Sound familiar? And Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf kept it to himself until a reporter asked him, "Why aren't you coming out for the anthem?" And the reporter said to him, "Don't you realize that that flag is a symbol of freedom and democracy throughout the world?" And there's actually videotape of this, and if you see it, Rauf has this look on his face like, should I say something? I think I'm going to say something. And he says, Well, it may be a symbol of freedom and democracy to some, but it could also be a symbol of oppression and tyranny to others. Now, when Raouf said that, it was like the sports world lost its mind in 1996. I mean, it was wild. Like ESPN was like, Raouf spits on the flag, booyah, dan-dan-it, dan-dan-it. And it was interesting because you mentioned before about creating like a space in our iPhone-obsessed social media culture. And 1996, of course, we didn't know what any of that was. So for those of us who were interested in this story, it meant gathering in a common room in the dorm. You had to be there at 7 p.m. sharp when Sports Center started. There was no getting there at 7:10 and then getting the DVR. There was, this was technology that did not exist. So you had to gather as a group and watch it. And then, of course, we're discussing it as a group. And I'll never forget, one of the talking heads on Sports Center said, well, Raouf must see himself in the tradition of activist athletes like Muhammad Ali or Billie Jean King. And I heard that, and it was like a light bulb went off in my head. Like, tradition? Activist athletes? What does that even mean? And so I went looking for text to find, and this is, of course, before Google, so there was no Googling activist athletes. I had to use not just microfilm, but microfiche. People, find an old dictionary for the younger folk. You could find out what that is. But what I couldn't find was a comprehensive book that detailed what this history was all about. That was written for a young person like myself who was not an academic, who was just coming to these ideas for the first time. And that's really when I said to myself, I want to write about this history. And then it got me to thinking also, if this speaks to history, then it must also, by definition, speak to the present as well. Chapters of this must be written in the present tense as we speak. And so that's what really got me involved in this kind of work. And it's been a passion ever since.
So just recently, you had a piece that was published, I think, this weekend in The Nation, where it was a very, I think, rare interview with John Carlos, one of the athletes from the photo that was mentioned earlier, 50 years ago in the 1968 Olympics. Many of you may not remember the Olympics or what happened then, but many of you have probably seen that iconic photo of John Carlos and Tommie Smith standing on the medal stand with their fists raised, really in a way that disrupted, I think, powerfully this kind of narrative of national pride in a moment when the nation was grappling with so many issues itself. First of all, what made him agree to talk to you? Because I think that would be very interesting, because he hasn't had many conversations about this. And then can you talk a little bit about this idea of his courage in that moment 5 decades ago?
Absolutely. John and I have been very close friends for 15 years. I did his book with him, his memoir, The John Carlos Story, the sports moment that changed the world. We wrote that together. And John is family to me, he's a dear friend. And that started back in 2003 when it was the 35th anniversary. And I was just getting started as a writer. And I thought to myself, what would be cool? It would be cool to track down the guy who was the bronze medalist raising his fist, because nobody's ever really heard from him. And so I Googled John Carlos. So I don't even think it was Google back then. We're doing a lot of history. I think it was like, people remember Ask Jeeves or?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it was like, Ask Jeeves, where is John Carlos?
Yeah.
And this very rinky-dink, even by 2003 standards, website came up with a phone number at the bottom. And I just figured, what else am I gonna do? I called the phone number, and I hear this voice on the other end just go, hello. And there's all this tumult and craziness in the background, like kids running around. And I say, hello, I'm trying to track down John Carlos. And he goes, this is Carlos, who the hell is this? Like, that's strong. And I'm like, I'm a journalist. I want to talk about 1968. And he goes, hold on 1 second. And I hear him yell like 3 people's names, and he's just like, Carl, keep it quiet down there. And I said, where am I calling? And he said, I'm the guidance counselor here at this public school in California.
Wow.
And I said, how long you been working there? And he goes, about 20 years. And so I say, well, do you want to talk about 1968? And he said, I'm not going to talk to you because you're not going to print the truth. And I said, well, give me a chance. And he said, all right, I'll tell you the truth. And if you run it, then maybe we can talk a second time. So, and he just went off about all the ways in which he was isolated after 1968, the price that he paid, the price that his family paid. And it is a harrowing story. that in terms of his isolation and what they put him through for having the temerity, for having the guts to use that platform to say something about not just the state of this country, but the state of the world. I mean, they were trying to speak about human rights on a global level. And I printed every last word he said, and that just started a friendship. And we've been very close ever since. So when the 50th anniversary came around, you know, I just said to him, like, let's talk. And when I say we've been friends ever since, like when the book came out, like we did a tour together, slept on floors, you know, he snores. I mean, this is stuff that, you know, you get close with somebody. And so it's the sort of thing where we're tight in a way that's beyond any relationship I have with anybody in the sports world. And what I try to communicate with folks about that moment, and I try to do this because it's like the responsibility that John gave to me, is that people know this moment of them raising their fists. But a lot of people don't realize that it wasn't just a moment, but it was a movement called the Olympic Project for Human Rights. It was a movement that was 4 years in the making, where athletes were organizing themselves to boycott the 1968 Olympics, to not show up unless some demands were met. And their demands by 2018 standards look so righteous in the rearview mirror, and it's almost hard to believe how controversial they were at the time. Like, this is what they wanted. They wanted South Africa and Rhodesia, apartheid countries, to be disinvited from the Olympics. They wanted more African-American coaches hired. There was only one in all of U.S. track and field, even though the overwhelming majority of the athletes were of African descent. They wanted Avery Brundage, who was the head of the International Olympic Committee, to be fired. If you don't know who Avery Brundage is, he delivered the Olympics in 1936 to Hitler's Germany, and he was openly amorous of people of fascist or Nazi origin. His nickname among athletes, Avery Brundage's nickname was Slavery Avery. And just as a little inside tip, if your nickname is Slavery, you're doing something wrong. You probably are doing something wrong. They wanted Avery Brundage fired, and their fourth demand was that they wanted Muhammad Ali's title restored. It had been taken away because of his opposition to the Vietnam War, and they called Muhammad Ali the warrior saint of the black athletes' revolt. So these demands are so righteous in the rearview mirror, and they were so electric at the time. And it put them in this position where they were not going to go to the Olympic Games unless they were met. Now, the boycott fell through, but John Carlos and Tommie Smith felt like they still had to do something. And so they came up with this idea where they said, we're going to wear black gloves on the medal stand. We're also not going to wear shoes to protest poverty. We're also going to wear beads around our necks and scarves as a showcase of the history of lynching and violence in the United States. And they planned all of this out. Of course, they had to do something first. They had to win. It would have been pretty silly if they came in 8th and they were like, oh, but we've got our beads and our gloves. You know, that would have been a disaster. But they were so confident in their own abilities. They were so confident, if you watch the race, John spends the whole time looking at Tommie, and he doesn't realize that over his right shoulder is a gentleman by the name of Peter Norman, who's the silver medalist. But if you look at the image, Peter Norman is wearing a button that says Olympic Project for Human Rights, and he paid a terrible price for that show of white allyship against racism at that time. And Peter Norman meant so much to John Carlos and Tommie Smith that after Peter passed away, way too young, if you Google this online, Peter Norman funeral, you'll see that the 2 lead pallbearers in Australia are John Carlos and Tommie Smith.
Wow.
So that's the John Carlos story in basic detail. There are other parts of it too, like before they got on the medal stand, they almost didn't do it because Tommie looked at John and said, what happens if somebody takes a shot at us, tries to shoot us? And John looks at Tommie and says, well, you know, we're trained to listen for the gun. And so, you know, he tried to just make him laugh a little bit. And so he said, so let's give it a try. So they got up there, they did it, and John has a very colorful way of speaking, and he said when they got up there on that medal stand, he said you could have heard a frog piss on cotton. That's how he described it. That's how quiet it got. And then people started booing, and people started throwing things, and they pumped their fists as they were being whisked off the stage. And, you know, the crazy thing is that just this past week, I've been doing with some other scholars. Now I get to say that now that I'm teaching a class.
That's right.
Which is very cool. with some other, it's a new robe for me. I'm just trying it on.
It's good. It
With
looks
some
good
other,
on you.
thank
It looks good.
With other scholars. We were looking back at all the media reports from October of '68, and the common theme you have, in addition to people trashing John Carlos and Tommy Smith, is in so many articles, so much so that you almost think it's organized. They say, no one will remember what they did. This is a footnote to the '68 Olympics, and it will be soon forgotten. And yet, 50 years later,
We're still talking about it.
here we are.
So what struck me about that is in your conversation with John Carlos was this whole isolation that happened after that moment. And I want to revisit that later on because I'd like to hear some of your thoughts about Cap and some of the things that happened as a result of him in that moment that oftentimes I think people thought, okay, we'll shut him down, we'll shut him up. And that has not happened. In fact, I think he's fueled a movement that has taken on a whole different life, which I think Michael Bennett talks about in the book. So I'd love to talk a little bit about how you all came together in this collaboration to write this book. And it was riveting from the beginning to the end. I truly enjoyed it. Matter of fact, you can see I got all my Post-it notes here about things I want to ask you about. So, but I'm interested, how did you all decide to, and how does that work? I mean, you are a professional writer. How does that work, working with an athlete who is very prolific and intelligent, but is not a professional writer?
Well, first let me say that there's no greater sight for a writer in the world than seeing a book filled with Post-it notes. Seriously, I'd rather sell 1/10 the books and have them just look loved in that way. You know, a book that looks like it's been dropped in the bathtub is the most beautiful book to me.
Yes.
So
actually, it did. It's so funny you should say that. Look, see, I got it wet. I got upset.
No, that brings a tear to the eye. Michael Bennett and I, believe it or not, we met on a stage in front of 1,000 people. That's where we actually physically met. Michael Bennett was playing for the Seattle Seahawks at the time, and he allied himself with a local teacher who's a very good friend of mine named Jesse Hagopian, who Professor Ntandi just brought to Montgomery College to speak, because he's a writer as well, and he's written some terrific books about education justice. And Jesse and Michael became good friends, and I was set to go out to Seattle independently and speak about a book I'd written about Brazil in the Olympics. Because the Olympics had just ended, and they were bringing me out there, and they were going to have me in a room at Seattle Town Hall, one of their little side rooms that seats about 25 people. Now, Seattle Town Hall also has a big room that seats 1,000 people. And Jesse got in touch with me and said, hey, instead of doing that talk on Brazil, how would you like to interview Michael Bennett on the main stage? Because Michael's into it, Town Hall's into it. Michael read your John Carlos book. What do you think? And I think I said something, a non-academic phrase of the type of hell to the of something. But it was like, just, oh my gosh.
We use that too.
Okay, good. Yeah. I was so excited at the thought of it, because I'd been following that Michael Bennett was this kind of outspoken athlete, the kind that I write about, the kind that I try to meet and speak with, and he was definitely somebody on my list of, oh, that's someone I need to talk to at some point and track down and hopefully speak with. And the idea that the first time we did it would be at Seattle Town Hall in front of 1,000 people, I mean, that was really exciting. So then there was a little bit of a hiccup when Seattle lost their last game of the year, and it was right going into the playoffs, and so the event was going to be 3 days before a playoff game against the Detroit Lions. There was all this talk about, like, wow, maybe he was going to have to cancel, that the team was going to say to him, we don't need you doing that 3 days before our playoff game. And this is when I knew Michael was something special. He said, hell no, I want to do this event at Town Hall. That sounds much more interesting than getting ready for this playoff game, which, by the way, they won. So proved itself out. And so we got on stage together, and what I found was that he was just so funny. That was the first thing that I noticed. Like, he had the crowd in stitches. I mean, just telling stories about his life, his brother who also played in the NFL, his brother who's bigger than he is, like 6'6", 270, and about the experience of them sleeping on a bunk bed and having the top bunk just fall. And just, oh my goodness, and then they had to sleep head to toe And so we had this rapport on stage that was really something special, and it was a lot of fun. And afterwards we went backstage, and he said to me, he said, hey, so you know, I asked you to do this because I read the John Carlos book. And I said, yeah, I heard that. Thank you so much. And he said, you should do my book. And I said, what? And he said, you should do, because I was just thinking, like, I'd love to get an article out of this.
Right.
Can we sit down and talk for 20 minutes? Like, that's what I was hoping my payment would be, you know, for flying out and doing all of this, 20 minutes with you so I could have an article. But he said, no, you should do my book. And I said, I didn't know you had a book. And he said, oh yeah, I've got a lot to say. And I was like, that made me very excited. And so I said, all right, let's talk about it. And we put it together. I mean, we really did the writing for it over the next 9 months. And it was during those 9 months, though, that he had the most tumultuous period. Like all the stuff with Kaepernick, like the aftermath of it, he was dealing with a lot of backlash he was dealing with. Also, he made a decision that he wasn't going to go on a trip that was sponsored by Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government in conjunction with the NFL. That was going to be like this goodwill trip, ambassador trip. And he made the decision that he didn't want to go because he was doing a lot of reading about the plight of the Palestinian people. Right. And when he made that decision to not go on this trip, a bunch of other NFL players said, well, we're not going to go either if Michael's not going. And that made that was like front page news across the Middle East that he made this decision.
Well, what I found fascinating is that he actually figured that out by reading an article from Israel that talked about the fact of what the intent was and the intention of not taking them to Palestine, which I thought was interesting. That was a part of his reading as he was preparing that was not given to him. It was just his own research and preparation.
Exactly.
I thought that said a tremendous about his integrity.
Yeah, he read that, and then he got in touch with myself and with Jesse and said that this trip is a problem. And Jesse got him a book by Angela Davis.
Oh, the queen.
Yeah, by Angela Davis. That was called Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Notes from Ferguson to Palestine. And he read this book. Like he told me, he read it in a night and just stayed up, and then he made this decision. So he's going through all this as we're writing the book. Now, you asked about the process, and that's an interesting process because to me, what's so important is that you get the voice. Like, it can't sound like me writing this. It's got to sound like Michael Bennett, and Michael Bennett has such a distinct voice. So a lot of it was, I would go out and spend just like the day at his house, hear him talk to his 3 daughters, hear he and his wife communicate, hear him talk, you get in arguments with his brother, his dad, and you just try to soak up as much as possible. Like, who is this person? How does he communicate with other people? And you try to almost like live inside their head. And then you sit down, you turn on the tape recorder, and you just talk. And then it becomes like a very intense psychotherapy session where it's like my job is to just try to talk as much as possible and in terms of like asking questions and probing questions, uncomfortable questions. And it's the interesting about the title of the book is that he said at the afterwards, I should have called it Things That Make Michael Bennett Uncomfortable. Because I mean, he's talking about the fact that his mother abandoned him as a young child, and how he was raised by his father, and then his father remarried and reconciling with his mother. And this 6'4", 280-pound football player would just start breaking down into tears and crying. And then he would go out of his way to be like, make sure you put that I'm crying in the book. Because I want people to know that people who look like me cry also. And I'm tired of people thinking that just because you're some big, tough football player, that definition of being a man means that you don't cry, that you don't show feelings, that you don't love your children. He said, I want to get away from that and get away from that stereotype. So yeah, I'm crying. And he's saying this as he's crying. He's like, so yeah, I'm crying, but it has to be in here. Like people have to feel that because I want them to feel the real thing.
Well, and I think that's a constant theme throughout the book of his authenticity and his rejection of this idea of a brand. I thought that was very powerful, that to a certain extent how whether it be the NCAA or the NFL has really to an extent tried to dehumanize these black men who are the dominant players in the NFL in such a way that they've internalized that. And this was almost, in my mind, his attempt to reject that and to create his own space again.
Yes.
And I also thought the title was an opportunity to do that, because you mentioned it could have been things that make Michael Bennett uncomfortable. He said, let's call things that make I should say white folks, but white people uncomfortable.
Well,
what was that? Because it obviously isn't just making white folks uncomfortable, but it had a purpose, and I'm interested in why.
It had a strong purpose, and actually, I talked him off his original title, which was Things That Make White People Uncomfortable at Dinner.
Ooh.
That's just what he wanted to call it. And I was like, it was more just because of length than anything else, because I like laughed out loud when he said that to me. I was like, at dinner, that's perfect. But I mean, the influence for the title for Michael was a couple of things. One was this quote that he read from Bill Russell, and I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. It's in the front of the book, but it was the great Bill Russell, the Boston Celtic, who was a terrific activist in his own right. He said that you can't make change in this country unless you make the majority white population uncomfortable, and then realize that in their discomfort, like they have to understand through their discomfort that we want change. And that affected him very strongly. And he said, so let's talk about that. He said, there's so much about our society that makes me uncomfortable. Let's see about making other people uncomfortable by telling some tough and difficult truths about what it means to be a black man in the United States, about what it means to be an NFL player in the United States, about what it means to be treated like a brand instead of a man, about what it means to play in the NCAA and be treated like part God, part cattle. And how that makes you feel, about what it means when people don't know how to speak to you and talk to you.
Well, they don't look at you.
Yeah.
They're looking at you. Does that mean I don't have to, so that idea of the objectification of your body. I mean, I'll watch the combine sometime, and you literally can look at the trainers, owners, which that's a whole commentary in here about why we call the folks who own the teams in the NFL owners instead of CEOs or something. I mean, it's a slave mentality, which we could get it. But this idea of saying, you look at them, they're measuring their biceps, their thigh size, I'm waiting to look at their teeth in a moment, right? Right, so there's a very interesting, which I love. I thought one of the reasons he called this out on page 9 when he said, being born black is a pre-existing condition in this society with a set of stressors that you can't understand without living in our skin, which goes to your point about if you can't understand that condition and you're unwilling to understand that condition because it makes you vulnerable, uncomfortable, or downright angry, then you can't affect the change that you're wanting to see. So I think it's a very powerful title for that reason.
And that's why I think Colin Kaepernick received such a backlash, and why Michael Bennett has received a backlash for his own protests against police violence and racial inequity that are staged during the anthem. Notice I don't call them anthem protests.
Right.
Because it's not protesting the anthem. As a wise person said, that's like saying that Rosa Parks was protesting the bus fare.
Right.
It's protesting something else entirely. And the reason why I think the backlash has been so much is not because people felt like they were disrespecting the troops, that's an absurdity, or disrespecting the country, that's an absurdity. The reason why the backlash is so intense is because they were imposing a discussion on people's NFL Sunday that people did not want to have and did not want to think about. Right. They were invading space that people say is apolitical. Of course, it's not apolitical at all when you're flying war jets overhead. When you're
the reason why we even do that now in NFL games, when it was a price that was paid by the military in such a way to encourage more people to engage or to go into the military. So let's even unpack that, right?
Well, that's why I laugh so hard when people say Colin Kaepernick was violating this long-held tradition in the NFL. And I was like, long-held tradition, like way back when Mission Impossible 4 was out instead of Mission Impossible 6, because it only goes back to 2009. That's when it started as part of a partnership between the Pentagon and the National Football League, a profitable partnership between the Pentagon and the National Football League. And so Colin Kaepernick and Michael Bennett and others were calling out the gap between what this ceremony is supposed to represent and the lived experience of black Americans. And it's so interesting, and it was white fans did not want to hear it. I think that's important to say, white fans, because I've been on a lot of shows on like MSNBC, CNN, and they look at the latest poll and they say people are polarized about these protests during the anthem. And I've said on the show, I said, no, people are not polarized.
Which people?
White people are polarized, because if you look at the polls, that's how it plays out. Like if you dig into it, Black Americans are saying, yeah, they have every right to protest, and it's within the white society that people are actually in disagreement about whether they have the right to even protest in the first place, to stage those protests.
So let's talk about the NCAA, which I thought was a
please.
very thoughtful. You know, we even talked a little bit earlier about youth sports, and if you can integrate that in here. But I thought this is a very poignant section in the book, and I'm doing this because I don't know if all of you've read the book. So, but I'm going to refer to page 23, where there's a commentary about this. And what he says, I'm sure that some fans care, but I know that the NCAA doesn't. We all know that. Ask most NFL and NBA players, and they'll tell you with the cameras off that the NCAA is a gangster operation, a shakedown, a system that works for everyone except for the so-called student athletes. And he goes further to say, the only sports in which you're not paid for the revenue you bring in are college football and basketball. This is not a wild coincidence. We tend to come from communities that are the least empowered, the most desperate for opportunity, so we get the shittiest end of the stick. It's a bullshit system that persists because we're too desperate for the chance at the brass ring, the pros, to organize and say no.
Yeah.
You've done a lot of writing about the way in which the NFL and sports in general have become so professionalized. Talk a little bit about your observations about this and Michael Bennett's as well.
Yeah, I mean, the good thing about writing this book with Michael Bennett is that he was talking about things to me that I'd never thought about before, and I just let myself take those in and be uncomfortable at times and just help him find his voice. But then there's some issues in the book where it's just like, yes, we are on the same page. And with the NCAA, like I'd written before that I felt like the NCAA is just an organization designed for the theft of black wealth. And that's its beginning and its end. Because if you think about it, it's an organization that makes billions of dollars. And that money, no one would otherwise go to black families. So like by definition, because the revenue producing sports are football and basketball, that's where the money would otherwise go. And yet you have this vacuum cleaner that takes it out, not just of the pockets of these players, but of these communities at the same time. And people say all the time, like, well, and Michael talks about this in the book, well, they're getting a free education.
Yeah.
And it's an absurdity. Like one player for the University of Maryland once said to me, he said, we're not student athletes, we're athlete students, because as soon as we get on campus, it's made very clear to us what our priorities are supposed to be. And I mean, if people have been following what's happening at the University of Maryland with the death of Jordan McNair, and that has rocked the campus out there and forced people to reckon with the role that these revenue-producing sports play, and also whether or not Black Lives Matter at the University of Maryland, if they're willing to have this happen to this player, when so many families had contacted the school and tried to warn them. And so anybody who says, well, they're just like regular students except they get to go to school for free, it's like, no, you're not dying on your campus in the heat, and while a coach yells at other players to drag you across the field because you're messing up a drill.
And attacking your masculinity because they think you're too soft.
Oh, yeah.
Right? That's a whole nother subtext.
Huge part of it that Michael also talks about in the book, that this idea that somehow you're not being a real man if you're not willing to die, basically, for football, to make money for a coach who is the highest paid public employee in the state.
Yeah.
And actually in 39 of 50 states in the United States, the highest paid public employee is either the football coach or the basketball coach at the state school. That's a wild scene. And I'll tell you, I've been to training rooms of NFL and NBA teams, and the training room at the University of Alabama. The training room at the University of Alabama is so much more lush and plush and five-star than anything that the pros have. And that's because they have this excess cash. And that's the way they try to lure players to Alabama.
Yep.
Is they say, look at this, we've got this training facility that's above and beyond. I mean, people joke that to go from the University of Alabama to the pros in some ways is a demotion. But it's interesting, too, that you have this most intensely in terms of the college football culture in the southeast of the United States, in the Southeastern Conference, in the old Jim Crow South. And this is something that Michael, who went to Texas A&M, talks about, how you've got the student section is overwhelmingly white.
Yep.
The players are overwhelmingly African American, and these are the same players who just 2 generations ago, and we're talking about this in my class right now, would not have even been allowed on the field.
Yep.
You know, as recently as 1960, you had laws across the South saying against not just integrated teams, but integrated stadiums. Yeah, so the change came through struggle, and I think we're at a time now, though, that we have to struggle and say that representation is not the same thing as progress. Like, just because people are cheering for black bodies, that's not the same thing as people respecting black minds, or there being a broader progress in the society itself.
And allowing them to be multidimensional. What I think is
exactly.
interesting, as long as you are an athlete and you stay in your place, in your lane, then all is well, because then we'll exalt you, we'll let you have all of these different things that we have, in particular, I'm thinking D1 schools who are in four-year institutions. And I love you all talk about that on page 115 in the book here. You say they don't think about developing our minds and obsess over their bodies. But it's hard to put the blame on athletes, because that's our obsession as a society. We praise the running, the jumping, and the showcase muscles, but we respond harshly when they think outside of the box or articulate controversial ideas. We don't like them to focus on hobbies, because once an athlete starts exploring quirky, fun interests outside of football, the questions start, why isn't he focusing on the sport? And he goes on to talk about this dehumanizing, demasculate, in a way that I found to be very profound. But he also spends a lot of time talking about the power of education. And he does a very interesting lift up of STEM.
Yeah.
He talks a lot about what STEM is. I'd love to hear your thinking about and your thoughts, and you all wrote this about why he thought STEM was such an important pathway.
Yeah, I mean, and that was one of the things that I'd never given a great deal of thought to before. But first, I got to say, one of the things that's interesting when I've spoken to this new generation of athletes that's been protesting and being much more outspoken than previous generations, so many of them went to college, have college degrees, but have only come to this consciousness as they hit 27, 28, 29 years old, and they're only like reading things that they're interested in for the first time as they've engaged in struggle. And it makes you wonder. It's like stuff that I think a lot of us, ideas that we came to when we were 18, 19, 20, they were in this school situation where it's just like, you know, where you're not being expected to learn, you're not being challenged to learn, you have to take classes that go around your athletic schedule. And my friend Howard Bryant was interviewing one of these athletes whose name I will not name, and he said to Howard something like, "Did you know that it was against the law to teach slaves how to read? Did you know that?" And Howard looked at him and said, "Yeah, I know that. Do you know that?" And he said, "Yeah, I just learned it." And he said, "Yeah, this is something that you need to know."
But the system isn't designed for that. You know, I think about as an undergraduate, and then as a graduate student, I was at a now Big 12 school, and I remember as an undergraduate, one of my jobs was I was a room checker. And my job was to make sure I get the list, and I had a set of classes that I go to, and my job was just to make sure, and I took attendance to make sure that the football player, the basketball player was there. Actually, I had football because I lived at where the football players were. That was one job. A second job was tutoring, so I would do that periodically. Then I had an interesting experience as a graduate student. I was teaching Comp 1, and I get a call as a graduate student from the athletic director. That never happens. Yeah. And the athletic director said to me, "Well, DeRionne, we're going to put this unnamed football person, he's a starting wide receiver for Iowa State University. We're going to put him into your team, and we're going to make sure that you work with him and he works with you because he needs to be successful. And I'm like, I'm all in. I'm going to help this young man, going to be good. He comes into my class. If he was reading at a 6th grade level, I'd be surprised. If he could write at a 6th grade level, would have even been happy as well. And then we compounded that with a travel schedule of a D1 division of a Big 12 school, and he was gone all the time. So, unsurprising, he started not performing well in class. Now, I'm a graduate student. I get a call again from the athletic director. We put him in your class. I'm going to let you all figure out why they put him in my class. Only black TA in the English program there. And you need to make sure that he's successful. So I called my graduate advisor, and basically I felt like the weight of the college is on me if I don't get him through this class. And I remembered the whole time, not once did they ask me what were the challenges with his performance. They weren't asking me about, what do we need to do to help him be support. It was, we need him on the field on Saturday. He has to meet these academic guidelines, and if he doesn't, it's going to be your fault. So and mind you, he did not pass my class. No matter, and I had multiple calls from the athletic department, and he eventually left the university. What I found, and I think the part is what I see in here when you all talk about this, the absence of the ability to see these players as people.
Right.
To understand that these are young men and women who are thriving and growing, 18, 19-year-olds,
Right.
should be having conversations about certain types, but they were all tracked into the same major. They were all tracked into the same types of classes, and the minute it deviated from what they thought it should be, it was no longer about that student. It was about the athlete as a student, right?
Yeah, I did a story a couple of years ago over at Georgetown. Now, Georgetown is a big-time Nike school, big time. And people know who John Thompson is. He sits on the board of Nike. This is Georgetown. And there were some students in the non-revenue producing sports who were starting to get very into an organization called United Students Against Sweatshops. And they wanted to pressure the university to pressure Nike about changing its labor practices. And they were doing things like taking the court with little tape across the Nike swoosh and things like that as a form of protest. And what they wanted to do was to have a meeting with the player, their fellow students on the basketball team, to get together and speak about issues pertaining to Nike. And the basketball team was told in no uncertain terms that they were not to go to that meeting. And if you take a step back from it, it's a wild story because you're talking about a college and you're talking about students coming together to exchange ideas. And then you're talking about somebody saying, no, you are not allowed to exchange ideas. I mean, maybe the basketball team would have gone in there and said, we disagree with you. We like being a Nike school. This actually helps us. But they didn't even have that opportunity or that freedom to be able to talk about that. And at this other school, I had this student described getting out of the school as like finally getting away from this coach as being in the Underground Railroad. And it's just this sense of feeling like you don't have choices. And sometimes that upsets people when people use, particularly athletes, I should say, use the simile or metaphor of slavery to speak about their situation. People say, oh, well, you're trivializing the horrors of chattel slavery. But what I see it much differently than that. I see it as they're reckoning with their powerlessness and trying to understand why they don't have the rights that other students have, why they don't have the rights that a worker would have if they were generating this level of money for the university. And they're trying to figure out their place in all of this. And the best way they can understand it is by thinking about it really in terms of a plantation and thinking about it in terms of their own history as a people and how it connects past and present.
I was profoundly struck that you all dedicated a whole chapter in the book on the N-word.
That was all Michael.
And
I promise.
And what I thought was particularly revealing about it was Michael's evolution on the use of the word. Could you talk a little about why he thought it was so important to have this in here, and then how you all grappled with how to write about this section? And then the last part would be about language and how you see it playing itself out in sports and politics.
Well, I'll just say,
politics of sports.
I mean, this was the first thing Michael said to me when we were going to do this book. I was like, you want to do this because we want to talk about your passion for girls' empowerment. That's a huge issue for him, is the empowerment of young girls. Because he is, through his own experiences with his own daughters and her friends, he's put a lot of time and energy into that. I thought he'd want to talk about Kaepernick and the protests. I thought he'd want to talk about police brutality and Black Lives Matter. But no, the first thing he said he wanted to talk about was, he said, I want to have a reckoning with the N-word in the book. And my eyeballs went like this. I was like, you sure you want me to write this with you? I don't know. Is this book like things that make Dave uncomfortable? I don't know. It was something. But his evolution on it came because he was somebody who, playing football growing up in the South, in particular in Louisiana and Texas, the N-word was used almost like a comma when he was with his brother and his brother's friends. It was just how you spoke and communicated with people. And as he said, it was a word that could mean a million different things depending on the context of it. Anger, love, affection. It depended on the inflection of how you used it. But then he was, there are two things that really shook him in a big way. The first was when he was doing a youth football clinic, and he heard it out of the mouths of like 10-year-old kids saying it to each other. And he found himself, as the adult in that situation, saying to them, do you realize that's the word that was used when people lynched our ancestors? That was that word. And he said, you shouldn't just say it, you should know the power that it holds. So that was the first thing that struck him, says we need to talk. The second thing that struck him was when the NFL decided to have a rule that penalized players for using the word on the field. And that wasn't put down there because white players were using it on the field. It was specifically aimed at punishing black players, using it in all the different contexts. And so it rubbed him the wrong way, the idea that the NFL was going to be the force that would try to correct how people spoke to each other. So he wanted to explore both the history of the word in terms of like its power when used by white America against the black community, and how it's used to isolate and destroy people, and also how it's used inside the community. And my response was like, for this chapter, I'm just going to be like your dictaphone, like say what you want to say, and I will tell you. Because in so much of the rest of the book, it's like collaborative, and but for that, I just said, my name's Paul, and that's between y'all, because you want to have. That's clearly a conversation that you want to generate in the community, and I respect that, and do your best.
And so, Paul, I thought it was a very poignant part of the book for several reasons. One, I think, as you point out, it's an in-group issue that we need to deal with. But I also thought it was a very interesting conversation about then how in-group can be co-opted by out-group. And, as someone who watches a lot of sports, I have become very adept at reading lips. And when you read the lips of players, you're often thinking like, did you know somebody gonna know what you just said right there? Why would you say that? So I thought what he amplified in this particular section is to talk about the power of words in a way that, when you go to Maya, to have to break this down for you, Maya Angelou, I believe the words are things. I think they stick on walls, they go into the upholstery, they go into your clothes, and finally into your very mind. So that words they manifest, they grow once they go inside, and they inform your psyche in a way that's particularly powerful. And that, to me, I thought when he talked about the young people, if you see yourself that way, you name yourself that way, you allow yourself to be named that way, then inevitably you will then begin to act that way and allow others to treat you that way, which is also powerful. That is right, that chapter is before the chapter on a moment of silence regarding those who have been killed at the hands of the police, and then Black Lives Matter. So it's almost like we can't talk about this yet until we talk about this part. And this part has to be, we have to do some work. So I'm just getting y'all got 5 minutes, get your questions ready, because then I got about 10 more, but I'm not gonna get to them, because y'all can see my book here is going on. But let me, before we turn to the audience, is to talk about Black Lives Matter.
Sure.
And I loved his boldness around these concepts and the idea of him actually speaking what it means. I also support Black Lives Matter, you all say on 145, because the idea that white lives matter is a given. We see it from the faces on our money to the faces on Mount Rushmore. White lives matter so much that as I write these words, there's a bloody fight to take down monuments to slavers who fought the Civil War to keep my people in chains. They're held up as heroes. There are 3 times as many monuments and Confederates in the U.S. Capitol as there are black elected officials. If we mattered in this country, how would that even be possible? And he goes on to talk about why the Black Lives Movement is so relevant, so much to say that, as he said at the start of the book, I'll be a football player for just a few more years, but I'll be black forever.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about this section.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to start with what you ended with, because that to me is why I wanted to go out to Seattle in the first place. Because what Michael was doing with my friend and Professor Ntandi's friend Jesse Hagopian was an event called Black Lives Matter at schools in Seattle, where they organized to get thousands of teachers in Seattle to wear Black Lives Matter shirts on the same day.
Right.
All in solidarity with the fact that some white supremacist group did a bomb threat on an elementary school because they did events around Black History Month and the events they were doing. And they highlighted Black Lives Matter as part of Black History Month. And so they got death threats at this elementary school in Washington State. So the union organized for everybody to wear Black Lives Matter shirts. Or I should say the Social Justice Caucus inside the union.
Right.
Give credit where it's due, please. And when Michael Bennett got involved in that, Michael Bennett was pressed by the Seattle media about why he was doing it, and he said those words. And that's why I said those words have to be in the book. And he said, because I'll only be a football player for a few more years, but I'll be black my entire life. So I have to say that Black Lives Matter. And I just love the unapologetic nature of his politics with regarding this issue, because, and I think this is one of the things that could make people uncomfortable, but to me, it's so much more dishonest to tiptoe around these basic truths, that certain lives are held up as mattering more than others. Like, how else can we explain mass incarceration in this country and how it operates? How else can we explain police brutality? How else can we explain the little things that now are getting highlighted on social media, like people calling the police on a barbecue, or the 9-year-old who the woman called the police because she said he touched her behind in a store, and then she was lying about it. And you're just like, is this the Emmett Till story in 2018?
Yeah.
What's happening here?
Yeah.
And without social media, I think that's another thing that makes a lot of white people uncomfortable, frankly, is that social media is highlighting stories that were well known in some communities and discussed in some communities and not others. And I think Michael wants to use his platform as a football player to say, hey, this is football, this is America's pastime, this is America's game. If you're going to cheer for black bodies, you're going to hear what's on my black mind.
Right, right. And I loved also where he, in the section on women, our daughters and the power of women, and how he calls out sexism and gender violence, how he calls out violence on LGBTQ community, how he speaks definitely and definitively about the brutalization of black women that has gone on since our arrival of chains in this country. To me, I thought was particularly, it gave me joy as a black woman to read that, because oftentimes when you read books about these types of perspectives, particularly from athletes, there's an absence of that.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that he is the father of 3 daughters is a great quote that Condoleezza Rice said, "My father became a feminist the moment I was born." And I always think about, when I read this, I kept thinking, oh, he probably was a feminist even before that, but he had now an actualization of that feminism in a way that he's willing to fight and die for it if he has to. And that meant a lot.
Yeah, and it meant a lot to me that he was willing to articulate it, because, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do the book with him. It's one of the themes that I try to pursue when I write, is this question of how masculinity is constructed in sports. And because I think sports, even more so than war in this country, is the most powerful force in teaching what it means for a boy to be a man in terms of the messages they get. And so many of those messages, I would argue, are destructive. Like, being a man means not admitting to pain, not admitting to psychological pain, not willing to be sensitive, not willing to open up. And I think that can lead to this incredible constriction around your heart and your mind and your spirit and your soul. And Michael shares that belief. And so he wants to say, if a football player can open up like this, and I'm supposed to be this epitome of manhood, then you can too. To me, it's as revolutionary as when Muhammad Ali told everybody how pretty he was, which you weren't supposed to do if you were a boxer in this country. You're not supposed to say you're pretty. And that blew the media's mind. You know, oh my goodness, heavyweight champion saying he's pretty. Like, what is that?
What's
like,
that mean?
What's that mean?
What's he trying to say?
Yeah.
He signified.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that a lot of people credit Ali for starting this idea in the 60s of black is beautiful.
Yeah.
And that was a revolutionary concept at the time. And I'm hoping that with this book, and through the fact that Michael's so public with how he feels, it can have a similar effect in getting a lot of young people to rethink and remake what the man box is that's constructed by sports.
Because I love how he also calls out, he said, you know, we wear pink for a month in the NFL for breast cancer, but that's so superficial if we aren't going to have a substantive conversation about domestic violence and sexism.
Exactly.
So, you know, this makes us comfortable because we can all wear our pink little stuff during October or whatever, but we don't do it any other time. We don't talk about what's happening to women and women's lives.
Exactly.
Audience, now y'all know I got more questions, but I would like to invite you all. Oh, look at this, look at here, look at here, look at here.
But before you ask a question, I really want to thank Madam President for being the best interviewer in the world.
No.
Really, it's terrific.
Oprah's job is safe, that's all.
I've been interviewed about this book, and people are just like, so, what's up with that? You know, and you're just supposed to talk. And so this is such a treat for me.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Dr. Clemmie, I'll let you go first.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you. My name is Clemmie Solomon. I'm the college-wide dean for student engagement, and athletics falls under my purview. I want to thank you, Dr. Pollard and Dave Zirin, for great discussion about radical inclusion in the context of athletics and human rights. And I also want to thank you for this great literary work that I really and thoroughly enjoyed reading. On another side, I'm from an athletic family. Jackie Robinson married my father's cousin, Ruth Solomon, and Jesse Owens was also a cousin. But my question is, in this two-part, what has been the feedback or reaction of NFL players of this book? And secondly, what additional advice would you like to give to student athletes as they pursue their dreams of being successful as student athletes? And we have a number of student athletes in the audience. But a whole bunch of them here. Oh, my basketball team, and so on and so forth. So thank you very much.
Wow. First of all, thank you so much. First, the reaction by NFL players to the book, according to Michael, has been almost like people passing notes to each other in a prison yard is the best way, is the description. like, hey man, I really like the book. Book's really good. So the feedback has been really positive, but not in this blaringly public way where people are going on Instagram like, buy this book, things that make white people uncomfortable, you know, because just even being seeing holding it can cause you some headaches that you don't want to have. And as far as advice, I mean, I don't feel like I'm one to give advice. I always feel like I've learned so much more from student athletes over the years than I've ever taught them sincerely when they've opened up to me about their experiences at this level. But I think the best advice to give is, first of all, to take sports history classes, please. Because I have some athletes in my class, and it's just like it brings history alive because it connects with what you do, and it's a way to learn history and learn politics all through the lens of sports, because I do believe that the lens of sports is very powerful to learn about all sorts of facets of the humanities and liberal arts. And then also just to get to see the institution that you're in is almost like an orange, and you want to squeeze every last bit of juice out of it that you possibly can while you're here, and that there are doors that are open, and to try to enter as many of them as possible.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hello. I've been thinking a lot about what's been said tonight, and I think a lot has been good, but there's something that I've been thinking about back when I was in high school that's kind of perplexed me, and I'll try to make it brief. Back, let's say, I think 2016, BLM started around 2016, 2017, right? Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, can you just talk into the mic? You got
Yeah, sorry.
more echo. Thank you.
My bad. Back when it was happening, and I was about to graduate high school, and I consider myself pretty left. I was like, yeah, I should involve myself in this. I want to show I care because I do care. I think everyone should be treated equally regardless of differences. But, and I know obviously this is going to sound like an exception, the African American students who were in my high school were like, oh, you just want to signify, you don't really care. And I was like, no, I really care. And so that kind of turned me off, and then I started seeing, and also, to be fair, I'm way too involved in social media than I should be. It can get pretty toxic at times. I mean, Twitter can be a dumpster fire, to be fair. But the main point is, I felt like I saw mostly just white people just talking about Black Lives Matter. Obviously, that's not the case, universally, but mostly when I heard, I didn't hear the people that I was friends with that are African American. I didn't hear them talking about it as much, and so I started to wonder: I'm not going to deny any of the work's done, but then I started to wonder: is diversity becoming a trend? Are people just saying it just to latch onto something? And that's scary, because no, diversity shouldn't be a trend that's just used just to promote popularity. It should be something that's cherished, and we should all support it. But what are your thoughts? Are people starting to treat diversity as something superficial, or is it, or is it? Am I thinking too hard about this? Sorry. Thank you.
I think it's important that you're reckoning with this. I think there's every movement historically has always had has depth, and at the same time has people who are attracted to it because they want to see change. And I think it's the responsibility of those in the movement to provide that depth and to integrate people into the struggle. As far as, I think one of the things you're getting at is white people in the struggle. First, in terms of what Michael was saying, is in terms of the NFL, was he's like, can some white players please stand up in solidarity with us or take a knee, please? Because then it gets some of the weight off of us. And that would be an act of tremendous allyship. I mean, if Tom Brady had taken a knee, all the stuff about Kaepernick would have stopped in a day. And it would have been the easiest argument, not to pick on Tom Brady, but it would have been although I don't like the Patriots, so it's easy. But it would have been the easiest argument to make in the world. All you have to say is, we're told all the time on a team that we're supposed to be like a family. Well, if there are people in my family, the brotherhood. If there are people in the brotherhood who are sad about something, well, then that's my brother, then I'm upset about it too. It would have been very easy to do. Now, on a grassroots or collegiate level, I think the most important thing for white people who want to fight racism is, first of all, to show up, is to actually be present. The second thing is to put yourself out there. If there's a police counter-presence, is to use that privilege to stand in front and actually try to help and protect people who are vulnerable. And also, most importantly, is like the saying goes, you know, the Lord gives you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, is do a lot of listening, and much more so than the talking. And I think building solidarity on that basis only makes us stronger.
You know, if I could also add one other point to that question, I have several very good friends who are very active in several progressive movements across the country. And one of them always tells me, said, what I would just tell white folks, go talk to more white folks. Mm-hmm. He said, we would benefit, he said, and I appreciate the fact that you want to talk about and be a part of discussions and to listen to the lived experiences of Black and brown people, poor people, LGBT, disabled, however we want to, you want to know that. But part of what also becomes important is the in-group conversations that have to be had, so that when you're able to go into those moments where you need someone who can then signify, who can then participate and lead in a conversation, you come from a place, have worked within your own group to be able to do that. And I think actually Malcolm X was asked that very same question in an interview. I know, Vincent, you know exactly what he said, but I know and in that interview, he said, basically, in effect, I think it was a white reporter, what can white America do to help Black America with racism and so forth? He said, go talk to white people. Mm-hmm. And it was such a backlash. People were like, oh, we're being sympathetic. We're wanting to be a part of the cause. There's a space and place for everybody in the cause. Let's find out where your space and place is. And part of that might mean first helping to talk with your people first, right? Yeah. Yeah, and educating. Yes, sir.
Dr. Pollard, thank you for a wonderful program. It's been more than 40 years since I paid tuition. And as a pensioner, maybe I should take advantage of the idea that I could take
or
a class.
you can be a donor, and I'll be happy to have one of my foundations.
Yeah, I'm actually
I have a lot of
I need
students
to
who
go
need
back to
financial aid.
school. But I have a question, and that's about the role of organizations in the current fight. So we often think about Rosa Parks as an individual that stood up, but she really was backed by the NAACP and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So I think your comments about, can we get an organization behind our current battles? And I wonder if you could update us on the role of the NFL Players Association or any other organizations that are backing this effort that often are where their roles are not being described. Thank you.
Great question.
Yeah, I mean, there's an organization called the Players Coalition of players who've been active, who've come together, and they managed to wrest $89 million out of the NFL owners to put towards community causes, and which I read as a victory. Like, anytime you can actually get something out of that. Colin Kaepernick is more critical of the Players Coalition. He thinks that they got together as a way to mute the power of the protests and to shift focus away from police brutality on broader, quote-unquote, community causes where you don't have to speak about police violence directly. And I think he has a good point there as well. Yeah, exactly. And so there's, but the fact that there even is organization, I think, is really important and an important start, because when people are alone and they feel isolated, it becomes a lot harder to speak out. Michael Bennett, there's a chapter in the book about it. He's part of a organization that he helped start called Athletes for Impact, which is male, female, black, white, across the spectrum. Like, if you're an athlete who wants to be active around political issues, this is an organization that'll provide support for you and provide you resources and provide you things to read and even like send athletes to where you are, and you can be a member if you're in high school or college or the pros. And I think in that kind of thinking, it's such an incredible step forward, because I think it also, unfortunately, when you have these lone football players speak out, it speaks to the myth of, like the myth of Rosa Parks, the myth of the heroic individual, and not the reality that it's organizations that really affect change.
That's a great point. Yes, ma'am.
Serena Williams came to mind to me tonight while the two of you have been speaking.
Always.
And I wanted to know if you could talk a bit about her in the context of athlete activist.
Well, I wrote an article a couple years ago where I said Serena Williams, this was before Kaepernick. I wrote this, I said, I thought Serena Williams was in many respects the Muhammad Ali of our time, not because she's was protesting like the Vietnam War. I mean, different times, of course, in so many different ways, but the fact that as a woman, as a black woman, entering this sport of tennis, coming from Compton, and not only surviving, but thriving. Not only thriving,
Dominating.
but dominating, but being the best, and not just the best of her generation, but ever.
GOAT.
And doing all of that, absolutely. And GOAT is the original nickname of Muhammad Ali, so that's the point of comparison. And the fact that she's used her platform to speak out, particularly on issues of mass incarceration, and that she, even like recently where there was the blow up heard around the world at the U.S. Open, the fact that she used that moment to speak to the way that women are treated in tennis, and the fact that so many people defended her immediately, like that I saw it as she was articulating the frustrations of being a black woman in this country and being policed in a way that white men, in this case in tennis, are not policed. And so you had some people say things like, well, she's not, well, she shouldn't have acted like that. She shouldn't have, it's a bad look for her to do that. And it's like, take a step back and ask yourself from her perspective, how this is going and what this is happening. I have to say, I did a talk at a college last week. The crowd was all white, and I was on stage, terrific sports writer, Howard Bryant, and we talked in conversation about 1,000 different topics. First speaker was a young man, came up and he said, I really disagree with what you said about Serena Williams, and this is why. And Howard said, do you know if Serena Williams was here right now, do you know what she'd be thinking? She'd be thinking, my goodness, these guys just talked about 100 different things, and the first thing you have to say is, I should shut my mouth. Of everything, that's what you pulled out of that. And it was like you could have heard a pin drop at that point. It was a moment.
It is a moment. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, well, first of all, I want to say that we're very fortunate to have you here this semester, and quite a few of us, if we weren't so busy with other responsibilities, would be sitting in on your class. And I hope the students realize what an opportunity they have. I've been following you.
Idea.
They have no idea. I did tell a few students who were looking for classes that they just needed to take it, and I would talk to them later. But nonetheless, I want to say, though, that your film, Not Just a Game, which all of you can watch. We have the streaming rights on our library. I use every semester as a mode of analysis, and regardless of whether students are interested in sports or not, what you demonstrate is undeniable. And although the film was made a while back, it's still true. And that's the beauty, I think, of a lot of the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
It's specific, and also it's widely applicable, and it's inspirational. So my question for you is, first of all, you are somewhat unique in terms of sports writers, well, at least white sports writers. And I'm curious what kind of comments or reception your work has among other white sports writers. And also, now you've done several books where you've been supporting black athletes to tell their story. And I'm wondering if you've ever gotten any kind of backlash from people about being in sort of a role where you're helping, but people might feel like you're appropriating or you're benefiting in some way.
Great
Yeah,
question.
that's a great question. The first part is, when it comes to white sports writers, I mean, it's as diverse and divided as the politics in this country. I mean, white sports writers who support the idea that athletes should have a voice are very glad that this work is being done, and those who are much more like on the, I call them access merchants, and they're willing to do what ownership wants them to do, so they get their golden nuggets of information. They think I'm inconvenient and aren't shy about telling me. But got thick skin, it's okay. Hurts sometimes, but you know, it's all good. And as far as that issue, the second issue about appropriating these stories, it's something I'm very conscious of and try to think about a great deal. And one of the things I try to do as a way to just mitigate that is I've got a publishing imprint called Edge of Sports that runs out of Akashic Books, and we try to focus on publishing black authors and telling black stories as much as possible as a way to make the pie bigger, you know, because it's like, I don't want to be the person primarily telling these stories. I want to help develop a new generation of writers who are of the community who can tell these stories. So if there's a way that I can do that and take a back seat, especially at this point in my life, that's what I want to do.
I also think it says something about visually how you chose to represent this in the title. So again, as a little bit of a linguist, I think it says something about this is the author, Michael Bennett, and Dave Zirin, very intentionally, not the same size, and that to me I think kind of goes to Professor Olmstead's point as well about from the moment you first encounter this, let alone as you start to engage with the text and other things, it becomes very obvious, at least in my mind, what I think what your intent was or your positionality in the story. Christian.
Trying.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello. I'm Christian Beldo. Dr. P, thanks once again for creating this platform. I believe the presidential dialogue is helping reinforce civility in our discourse. And I'm happy to be here. Last week, Dr. Brown gave me a copy of the book and asked me to read. And I read all the 220 pages. And interestingly, I had quotes and questions that I was going to ask. And for some strange reasons, you used those quotes and you asked those questions. But what I wanted to ask about is about Kaepernick and the Nike deal. We've got much more insight than I do, than most of us here do. Do you think Nike is genuinely supporting the cause, or you think they are just appropriating and just commercializing the movement?
I think Nike supports the cause like McDonald's supports cows. Yeah. I mean, McDonald's does have a vested interest in the cow community growing and thriving. Of that there is no doubt, but they have an end game for the cow. And there's something about Nike where and I've written about this for 30 years. They have taken struggle and rebellion and used it to sell product and stripped that struggle and rebellion of all conceivable content. And my fear, and I've written about this, is that they aim to do the same. I think Colin is strong enough to not let it sideline him in terms of what he wants to do, but I also would not trust Nike's aims, especially when they give millions of dollars to the very politicians who spent the last 2 years demonizing Colin Kaepernick. That's something that cannot be overlooked or ignored.
So, sir, if you don't mind, I'm going to come back to your question. I'm going to close the formal part of this because we're on camera, and they've told me I've got 3 minutes. So I've got to say, do a couple of housekeeping things, and then we'll come to your question right when the camera goes off. So I know we're getting late, and we're going to, this gentleman stood in line, so I want to get to his question right when we get done here. But I want to thank everyone who chose to be here tonight and to be engaged, both in terms of the question you posed, but also your faces. As someone who has to sit in these spaces oftentimes, you get your energy from your audience. You can tell when an audience is engaged in a topic, so thank you all for choosing to be here. I want to offer some thanks, first of all, to MCTV, who is always just professional, thoughtful, and if I have a crazy idea, they always figure out how to make it happen. So thank MCTV. Megan Givens, Dr. Givens from my office, who made it look like I was so brilliant in my interview questions. It's really Dr. Givens, who does a phenomenal job in prepping. And then certainly to our campus here, Tacoma Park, Silver Spring campus. I knew for a fact that you would look across this audience and not see all white faces, because we are at a campus that is radically inclusive intentionally. I really want to thank the Meyer Foundation and Julian for being here tonight, for their generous support of this series, and certainly for their belief in what we're trying to do here. Our next one will be on November 27th, when we'll have Neera Tandeen, the Executive Director of the Center for American Progress, and she's going to talk about how domestic policy can contribute to the politics of radical inclusion. And finally, I want to thank my part-time faculty member, but also a colleague who I got to learn tremendously from tonight, Dave Zirin, for joining us and for writing so many provocative books about topics that cut to the heart about national conversations around inclusion. You created a platform for discussion. I'm thinking Dr. Mills might be a great professional development workshop to have him come and do one for faculty and staff. I think a number of them would enjoy it. So I can always tell you this is going to be full, so just make sure we work around my schedule so I can be on that too, all right? I want to thank our students. How many students do we have here tonight? Yeah.
That's great.
So you all are why we do the work. And I'm so honored and pleased to see you here. I just got to give a big shout out. I see a whole bunch of my our athletic team members here, and just want to thank them. I think it means a lot with your leadership to be here, but also to bring players to be a part of the conversation. So thank you all and good night. I hope I wrap that up 8:30 on the dot. I am
So good.
all right.
You're good at
Thank
what
you
you
all.
do.